The church in Corinth had big problems. They had sin problems. Some of them had big problems with each other. And when Paul wrote his letter to the church in Corinth, he was writing about those big problems. And he talked to them about the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is the one who gives us the resources to deal with big problems like sin or like big problems with each other. And that's why in our current paradigm, the Holy Spirit is at the center. If we want to rely on God's resources so that we grow, it all begins with the Holy Spirit. So Paul told the Corinthians this: "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" Paul was frustrated with the Corinthian Christians and their big problems. They weren't relying on the Holy Spirit. It's almost like they had forgotten the Holy Spirit altogether. The first memory verse in our series brings up 3 conversation starters for you as you memorize. First, God's Holy Spirit lives in and among Christians. Second, the church is the temple of God on earth. And third, we should love God and each other in a way that shows God to others. Well, first, God's Holy Spirit lives in and among Christians. In our verse, Paul says, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" Now, what's interesting is in the original language, Paul doesn't say the singular word for you. Instead, it's a plural. It's almost like Paul is saying, "Do y'all not know that y'all are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in y'all?" We know from other scriptures that the Holy Spirit lives in every individual Christian, but that's not what Paul is saying here. The Holy Spirit also lives in us as a community. He lives in us and among us. What does that mean? I mean, I can understand the idea of him living in me, but living in us, among us? Well, first, it means that I should think about other Christians, treat other Christians, and act toward my church like they're people filled with the Holy Spirit. That means I should honor them. It means I should listen carefully to what they say. It means I should love them. No Christian is more important than another because we all have the Spirit. But the Spirit is not just in us individually, He dwells among us. When Christians gather together as a group, the Holy Spirit is at work in our midst. When Christians talk to each other, the Holy Spirit is there ministering to us and through us. When Christians get together, live together, serve together, the Holy Spirit is active in our midst. And that means we can have big expectations from God for how He will work in Christian homes, in Christian churches, and in Christian communities. We are more than the sum of our parts. But that's where Paul says even more in our memory verse. The church is the temple of God on earth. When you're discussing this verse, ask the question, what did ancient people expect from a temple? You know, why would you go to a temple? Well, you would go to a temple expecting to experience the God of that temple. You go to the temple of Zeus, what are you going to do? You're going to see statues of Zeus, you're going to hear what Zeus teaches, sing Zeus songs, right? You go to a temple of Baal, same thing. You expect to learn something about that God, to experience that God's message and power. Where is Yahweh God's temple? There used to be one in Jerusalem, but it was destroyed. In 586 BC, the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem and destroyed it. And the temple was later rebuilt by Joshua and Zerubbabel, but it just wasn't the same. In fact, the people who remembered the old temple wept when they saw the new one because it fell so far short of the old temple. What was missing? God's presence. But that temple, that one then got destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD after it had been built on. There's a whole long history. But here's the question. There's no temple. It's been destroyed. So where can people go if they want to meet Yahweh God, if they want to know God, if they want to experience His message and power, if they want to see and behold Him? They go to the church. And I don't mean the building, I mean the people of God. God lives in and among us. If people want to know God, if they want to hear His message and want to experience His power, they can come to local gathered communities of Christians like FPC. FPC is the temple of God. First Baptist Covington across the street is the temple of God. Every local Christian congregation, like the Corinthian church, is the temple of God. And people can know God by experiencing us. We are God's temple, and His Spirit lives in us. But that means something, doesn't it, about our lives, how we should live. It means something about our communities and our community life. We should love God and each other in a way that shows God to others. That's Paul's point. He's correcting the Corinthians for failing to love each other. He's confronting them for their sin. If people came to their church or got to know their community, would they see God? No, they'd see a mess. But if they would rely on the Holy Spirit, God would change their community. If they would rely on the Holy Spirit, they would love God more faithfully. They'd love each other more faithfully. When outsiders got to know that community, what would they experience? They'd experience the God who lived in them. They'd experience God's character and God's love. And that's what God is calling our church to be. A community so in love with God and with each other through the power of the Spirit that when people come to us, when they experience our community, they experience God. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? You do know that. So let's memorize it, rely on the Spirit, and live accordingly.